I'm in high school, and recently there was a staggering 2,000 plus people at the CNE job fair. I am struggling to even find a job at McDonald's. How are teens supposed to get job experience without getting a job? Minimum wage jobs are supposed to be meant for young adults and teens. Instead, the jobs are being taken over by overqualified people, immigrants. I'm not trying to be racist in any way. These comments reflect the frustrations of young adults facing a tough job market. Even entry-level jobs like landscaping and fast food are flooded with applicants, making it nearly impossible for teens to gain experience. Some suggest alternative routes, like working in junkyards, brutal, dangerous labor that many avoid. Meanwhile, highly educated immigrants, including doctors and nurses, are forced to take minimum wage jobs because of the difficult process of getting their credentials recognized. The reality is harsh. Young people and overqualified workers are fighting for the same low-paying jobs, leaving many wondering, where do we go from here? Jobs are not the only struggle here. Someone commented, living in Canada is easy. Just buy your house 35 years ago. It reflects on how housing was significantly more affordable 30 to 50 years ago, and the wages have not kept pace with inflation. And government policies, corporate real estate ownership, and financial speculation. And that's why home ownership is nearly impossible for younger generations. Canada has long been dealing with a housing crisis that's pushed home ownership out of reach for an entire generation. On top of that, immigration policies and the skyrocketing cost of living, driven by inflation, have made everyday life harder. It feels like we are just trying to keep our heads above water.
We'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a number of reasons.
Today, the United States informed us they will be imposing 25% tariffs on Canadian exports to the United States.
Now, with these tariffs being imposed, the situation is more complicated than ever. The question isn't just how Canada will weather this storm, it's how it can continue to move forward when it seems like it's already fighting a multitude of battles. What happens when two major countries, like the US and Canada, find themselves in conflict? For Canada, it's a precarious situation that has been intensifying over time. Canadians never quite expected this combination of challenges, particularly at a time when they're already grappling with their own internal issues. Before we get deeper into what these tariffs mean for the future of Canada and its citizens, let's take a step back and examine why life in Canada is increasingly becoming a struggle for so many. How did things reach this point? Just a few years ago, Canadians were inspired by Justin Trudeau's promise of real change.
What we need is real change and leadership that fixes what Stephen Harper has broken.
When he was elected Prime Minister in 2015, his message resonated with people who hoped for an affordable, thriving future. But today, that dream has turned into a nightmare. One of the biggest challenges facing Canadians is the skyrocketing cost of housing. The average monthly rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto is approximately 2,500 Canadian dollars, whereas in Berlin, the average monthly rent for a one-bedroom apartment is approximately 1,600 Canadian dollars. The average monthly net salary in Toronto is around 4,500 Canadian dollars. Renting a one-bedroom apartment consumes approximately 55 to 60% of the average income, making housing relatively unaffordable for many residents. Whereas in Berlin, the average monthly net salary is around 3,650 Canadian dollars, lower compared to Toronto. Renting a one-bedroom apartment consumes approximately 40 to 45% of the average income, making it more affordable than Toronto. Since 2016, nearly 3 million immigrants have been admitted, placing significant pressure on the already strained housing market. This surge in population, combined with underbuilt housing, has caused demand to skyrocket, pushing rental prices to unaffordable levels. Even foreign students are feeling the pinch, with many resorting to living in vans or sharing overcrowded rooms. As housing prices climb, so do the prices of everyday essentials. Food prices in Canada rose by over 10% in 2022, with nearly 2 million Canadians visiting food banks in 2023, a record high. Grocery chains, operating in a highly consolidated market, have been able to extract maximum profits without facing much competition, driving up food costs. A key factor contributing to Canada's economic stagnation is a decline in productivity. While the U.S. saw a 6% increase in economic productivity between 2019 and 2023, Canada has faced a decline. Private sector investment in Canada is dwindling, as companies prefer to invest in markets that offer greater returns, particularly the U.S. This lack of reinvestment is tied to Canada's unfavorable business environment, marked by high taxes, a lack of competition, and government policies that hinder industrial growth. What's happening in Canada isn't just a housing crisis, it's a part of a broader cost of living crisis. And shockingly, we are now facing an immigration crisis too. The Canada I knew and admired seems like a distant memory. What happened? In 2022, the country's population grew at its fastest rate in nearly 70 years. The government planned to welcome 465,000 permanent residents in 2023, 485,000 in 2024, and 500,000 in 2025. The target was to have 60% of these newcomers be economic migrants, focusing on sectors like healthcare, skilled trades, manufacturing, and technology. But there were already 2 million backlog immigration applications and a housing shortage. Despite these challenges, Trudeau and his cabinet saw immigration as the solution, not the problem. A lot of folks are questioning immigration policies. There's this sense that the system is flooded with too many people coming in and pushing the demand for housing even higher. For some, it feels like immigrants are filling up low-wage jobs, making it harder for locals, especially teens and young adults, to get a foot in the door. On top of that, wages just aren't keeping up with the skyrocketing costs of living. People are working long hours, multiple jobs, and still can't make ends meet. With inflation hitting everything from groceries to transportation, it feels like the money just doesn't stretch far enough anymore. Even those who've worked hard and invested in their education are left wondering how they'll ever break out of the cycle of low-paying jobs and high expenses. Meet Alex, a skilled immigrant who moved to Canada from Ukraine, hoping to make a better life. Alex is a mechanical engineer, and his wife also has a university degree. When they arrived, they were told Canada needed their skills, so they were hopeful. But quickly, they found out that the Engineer Society of BC made it nearly impossible for Alex to have his qualifications recognized. The bureaucratic hurdles were so high that it seemed easier to go back to school for a local degree. With 2 teenage kids at home, going back to school wasn't an option, especially since they were barely scraping by. So Alex started from scratch, taking a job at a car wash, and later transitioning into carpentry, a field he had once worked in as a hobby. Fast forward 22 years, and Alex is now about to retire as a carpenter, never having fully utilized the skills he once honed in engineering. His story reflects the disillusionment of so many skilled immigrants who come to Canada with hopes of a brighter future, only to find that even with qualifications, it's harder than ever to get ahead. The housing situation didn't help either. Despite all their hard work, Alex and his family were never able to afford the kind of home they dreamed of. For years, they lived in cramped spaces, just like so many others in Canada. It's a reminder that for many, the Canadian dream isn't quite what they expected. It's not about working hard and buying a home anymore. It's about surviving in an increasingly expensive and difficult environment. Alex's story resonates with countless people who feel like they've done everything right, yet the dream of prosperity in Canada feels more and more out of reach. Now, coming to the current trade tensions between Canada and the United States, the consequences could be truly devastating for Canada, especially considering the significant reliance on U.S. trade. Approximately 67 to 70% of Canada's total trade is with the U.S., and around 2/3 of its GDP is dependent on that trade. According to the chief economist of Global Affairs Canada, nearly 2 million jobs in Canada, both direct and indirect, are reliant on exports to the US. This situation is catastrophic, with no sugarcoating the impact. But it doesn't stop there. The Canadian dollar could take a major hit. A sharp depreciation in the Canadian dollar would likely happen overnight, which means that imported goods would become more expensive. Canada imports about 1/3 of its GDP, which adds up to nearly $1 trillion in goods. This means that food, clothing, electronics, and fuel, you name it, will cost even more for Canadians, making an already tough situation with inflation worse. This could hit Canadians especially hard because during the winter months, we import many fruits and vegetables from warmer climates. This will skyrocket in price due to the devaluation of our dollar and the cost of tariffs. We're talking about massive job losses. According to data from Global Affairs Canada, 2 million Canadian jobs are tied to U.S. exports. If the U.S. slaps tariffs on Canadian goods, a significant portion of these jobs could be lost. This would disproportionately affect industries like auto manufacturing, forestry, and agriculture, which rely heavily on U.S. markets. Now that Justin Trudeau's government has struck back at the U.S. with similar tariffs, the clock is ticking to see how this will unfold for Canada. As the two countries clash, it's the Canadian people who stand to suffer the most in this economic showdown. The very heart of Canada's economy, its manufacturing, exports, and working-class industries, is under siege. In the end, it's the poor and vulnerable Canadians who will bear the brunt of this trade war. As prices rise, jobs are lost, and industries crumble. The true cost of this diplomatic battle will be paid by those least able to afford it. The dilemma is real, and it's a matter of time before we see just how deep the wounds will go.